Good evening. Welcome to this Institute for Government event on the rise and fall of the Department for International Development. Welcome to everybody in the room who's made it here to the IFG and to all of those watching online. And we are here in particular to mark the recent launch of this book of the same title by Mark Lowcock and Ranil Dissanayake, who are both close friends and former employees of DfID, and it would be fair to say take a sympathetic eye to the department, but one in the book you will find is not wholly uncritical. And the story of DfID illustrates a range of different themes, lots about the successes and failures of international development and aid, which I'm sure we'll cover those over the next hour. But as we're here at the Institute for Government, I'd highlight that for me in particular, what DfID's 23-year story tells us about effective government, how departmental structures matter and can change policies and lives at home and abroad, the importance of setting clear and consistent objectives, why ministers and civil servants really should stay in the same job for a while, the strengths and weaknesses of political consensus, and how an institution that had, by Mark and Ranil's account, a pretty good run, ended up losing the confidence of politicians at the top of government. So all of this and more in the next hour, with drinks afterwards for those of you who are in the room, and those online can pour yourself a drink straight away. My name is Alex Thomas. I'm a programme director here at the IFG, and we have a panel to end panels to reflect on the book and to discuss the issues. Of course, Sir Mark Lowcock is co-author of the book with Ranil, Permanent Secretary at Department for International Development from 2011 to 2017, then at the UN as Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and much else besides. As I said, Ranil's here too, and I'll bring him into the conversation a bit later on. Sarah Champion is the MP for Rotherham, campaigner for social justice, so various shadow ministerial roles, and for our purposes today has recently been re-elected as chair of the International Development Committee. And Andrew Mitchell is the MP for Royal Sutton Coldfield, Secretary of State for International Development from 2010 to 2012, Minister of State for Development in the new FCDO from 22 to 24, and is currently Shadow Foreign Secretary. And have you voted in the members' ballot yet?
I have, yes.
You have. Excellent. Job done.
For Kemi.
And before we get going, here's the first call for questions. Get thinking in the room here, and for those tuning in remotely, use the Slido functions on your screens. And when you ask a question, if you can say who you are and what organisation you're from, if you're able to. And for those online, uprate the questions so that I can try and ask them when they come through. Mark is going to kick off by talking about the book for a few minutes, picking out some themes to discuss, and then we'll get on with some questions from me to the panel and then discussion. So, Mark.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm really pleased to be doing this with Andrew and with Sarah for the following reason. Development policy in the UK is discretionary for governments. It's not like the defence budget or the welfare budget or the NHS, which are topics on which, as a practical matter, governments of any colour have actually quite limited room for manoeuvre. Development, there's lots of discretion, and it speaks absolute volumes for the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and David Cameron and Theresa May that they decided to give a priority to it. And that was one of the reasons for that, was because there were a lot of parliamentarians, of whom Sarah and Andrew are fantastic examples, who really care about these issues. And as Alex says, one of the things we've done in the book is describe the absolutely fundamental role that politicians and politics played in the story of the Department for International Development. The 1-minute bluffer's guide, if you like, to the book that Ranil and I have written goes like this. In no previous quarter century in the whole of human history did life improve so much for so many people as in the 23 years of the life of the Department for International Development. That period saw a massive reduction in global poverty, a big increase in life expectancy. I used to live in Malawi in the mid-90s. When I was there, then average life expectancy was 43. When DfID was abolished, it was 63, exactly the same numbers in Afghanistan. Massive expansion in access to education, to clean water, and lots of other improvements in the lives of very poor people. And the Department for International Development made a very big, spoiler alert, made a very big contribution to that huge progress. And the main thing we do in the book is describe how DfID made that progress. A lot of the people who registered for this event, some of you in the room, some of you online, I know have got interest and expertise in very particular areas. There's some of you are health specialists, some of you are education folk, some of you are natural resources or climate folk. Some of you are interested in the political economy of development. What you'll find in the book is Ranil's take and mine on all of those issues in DfID's life. And if you consult the index, you'll be able to see the bits you particularly want to read. Now, then along came in 2020 Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson vandalised the Department for International Development. He destroyed it. And at the time when the merger was announced, the story the government told was this was in order to improve the effectiveness both of our diplomacy and our development effort. And that was what we call, in technical terms, a lie. That was not the intent. And if you read chapter 12 and 13 of the book, you'll find out what the real motivation was. And people like Andrew and Sarah in particular were very clear and outspoken in describing what was really going on. If you then read the second half of chapter 13, what you'll see is the inside story of how the Labour government, starting from the position that Andrew began a road to recovery from when he was appointed again as the minister in 2022, what the Labour front bench in opposition were thinking about in terms of the approach they would take if they were to win the election, which everybody thought would be about now, but as we all know, took place in July. You'll find the inside story to what happened. And then in the last chapter, you'll get the answer from Ranil and I on what the new government should now do. So that's what the book does, basically. I thought I would just talk about a couple of points, Alex, at the beginning. The first is to make a point about objectives. And I make this point because it's highly germane to what we see going on in government at the moment. Before the Department for International Development was created, for most of the previous 40 or 50 years, a lot of thinking about the British role in development was that it was trying to hit lots of objectives in lots of different places. So, for example, Judith Hart in the 1970s brought in tied aid, and the idea was that that would support the British economy as well, help with development. The Thatcher government famously tied a huge arms contract in Malaysia to a building of a dam the Malaysian government wanted. The government of Tony Blair cleared away all those mixed objectives and focused just on poverty reduction. And what happened when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister is that all those mixed objectives came back. And the lesson of history is if you're not super clear about having one focus for your development effort, in the case of DfID on reducing poverty, what you find is you do a terrible job on your mixture of objectives. That aid tying system costs $7 billion a year on the best analysis in reducing the value to developing countries of aid. And we have in the book described a bunch of the other scandals that were perpetrated in this era of mixed objectives. Now, the reason I say that is because, to some people's surprise, the current government seem to be leaning into the idea you can use your development budget to leverage some of your other objectives. And that way, we conclude, lies ruin. The second thing I wanted to say at the outset is something about delivery capability. And I say this because I think this is relevant to the wider agenda the government has now. As we all know, there's going to be pretty obviously some increase in some departmental budgets in the spending review when it's announced. Health budget will go up a little bit. There'll be more money available for capital investment. But the new money available won't be nearly enough to achieve the objectives that the government has. I am an accountant who studied economics and went to business school. And the sort of defining challenge I found through my 32 years in DfID was we had these huge objectives we were trying to achieve and never enough money. So there was an absolute premium on making sure every pound worked as hard as possible. And that was the characteristic of Andrew's first tenure in the department, which Justine Greening then sustained. So if you want to make every pound work as hard as possible for your objectives, you need to do a few things really well. Firstly, you need to identify really good investments with a high return. And in order to do that, You need expertise and local knowledge, and you also then need a system. You need a system for turning the things you've decided to do and the money you've decided to spend into the actual outcomes, improving the lives of real people in the real world. And that was the thing that DfID was really, really good at. And when in the 6.5 years I was the permanent secretary, the thing that I spent most of my time on, which wasn't visible, I can tell you, to my ministers at the time or to most other people outside the department, the thing I spent most of my time on was, once ministers had approved an investment, I spent a lot of time on making sure it delivered its actual results. Now, the tragedy of the destruction of the department, the vandalism, is that it's now almost impossible, because of the hemorrhaging of the expertise and the destruction of systems, to do as good, even a decent job in turning the money into real-world outcomes. And that is the delivery challenge. Lots of you will know that the government have hired Minouche Shafiq to advise them on how to build on the first steps that Andrew has taken to rebuild a respectable role for Britain in international development. And Ranil and I have said you have to sort out the resource issues, you have to decide your objectives, but the big thing we've said is you really have to sort out the delivery system. All the other big providers of official development assistance, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, the US, the European Commission, who between them account for 70% of the world's official development assistance, they all have a separate institution to deliver their aid program from the one delivering their diplomatic effort. I think we need in this country a much stronger diplomatic service than we have. We've made a mistake nationally, not adequately to invest in it over generations now. But in order to be good at the diplomatic thing, you need a completely different set of skills and processes and culture to what you need for development. Diplomacy requires languages and understanding of negotiating skills and trade-off management, and you're always dealing with short-term issues. Development, by contrast, is about money and project management and expertise, and often about the long term. So one of the challenges the government really face now, if they want to rebuild Britain's role away from the laughingstock we turned ourselves into on these subjects in the years after 2020, back to a respectable role, is rebuilding the capability. And I hope everybody understands that point adequately, and crucially, they listen to what I know are going to be the very wise things that Minouche Shafiq will be telling them about that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. I'll ask a few questions now to Andrew, Sarah, and Mark. So first, Andrew, I know you told me on the phone earlier today you've read every word of the book. So what did you make of it, and how it takes us through the arc of the Labour and then Conservative administration?
So thank you very much, and it's very good to be appearing on a panel like this with Sarah, whose committee doing a sort of masochism tango I have appeared in front of quite a lot in the last years, and also Mark, who was my second permanent secretary, Minouche Shafiq being the first one. And I agree with everything you have said, and I think it was a very good working relationship. I wanted to just say a few things about the book, and then a little bit about the challenge which Mark has set out. The book is brilliant. It's a very, very good encapsulation. It deals with the academic, the charts and the analysis and so on very well, but it doesn't do it in such a way that it suffocates the interest, which can often happen in these sort of books. And also, although it is too much a civil servant's view and not enough a minister's view, it's very generous to the ministers. Indeed, parts of it you may conclude were written by Secretaries of State's mothers in the thing. It says that this was a liner built by Labour, which the Tories travelled on a bit. And it says that David Cameron, as though trying to explain how wicked Tories could possibly have got it, it explains that David Cameron and I were from the Live Aid generation, which is, I'm afraid, not a fair comment. That both David and I believed, and this is the critical point, that Labour and Blair, particularly, and Brown too, had done a good job. And so we thought that they had built the ground floor, the foundations of the building that was British international development policy. And we, the Tories, were going to put the next floor on it. I would just wish to steer off a bit the idea that this was Labour's liner, which the Tories hopped on and then hopped off, although we did hop off later on. Of course, the great prize, which I believed was essential, and which I think was an original point of mine, was that in order for this to work, it had to become a British policy and not a Labour or a Conservative policy. So I used to irritate my predecessor, Douglas Alexander, by saying it's not a Labour policy, or a Tory policy, it's a British policy, because of course it was then a Labour policy. And there were people in the department when the Tories arrived in 2010, one of whom specifically said he wasn't sure that he would be able to work under the Tories in the department. You know, we had to, and Minouche Shafiq was brilliant at saying, you know, that this is not how the system works, and we're a Department of State. It all worked out. There was a seamless transfer of power in 2010, which there might not have been, and that's a great credit, I think, to the department. Now, in the book, I do not think it gives enough credit for this first floor of the building to David Cameron and the Tories. First of all, the results and evaluation work that we put in, that you had to focus on results, that you would never be able to sustain British support for the Point 7 and for development unless you could show, I think it was Mrs. Smith in Acacia Drive, Sutton Coldfield, I used to belabour civil servants with, unless you could show her why every penny of her hard-earned money, every pound, was delivering 100 pence of delivery. And the reason why we set up the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which has survived so far, was so that it would give people an independent view of why development worked so hard. I think that was genuinely good Tory building. We also, incidentally, I think both parties did this, but we were very, very clear, particularly since there were 3 grey-haired men in the ministerial team, that unless you see development through the eyes of girls and women, you are missing the point. So, and this goes back to poverty, which the book writes about extremely well. And I do think we get some credit for that as well. The book completely underestimates the importance of the reforms of CDC. And that is because the department simply didn't understand CDC, and there were bad Public Accounts Committee appearances, and the department didn't love CDC very much. Indeed, Actis was floated off in a very bad deal before we got there. So, and I think the importance of CDC is still underestimated, though much less so now, because, I mean, CDC is providing directly 1 million jobs in the poorest parts of the world. This is food on 1 million tables, as well as paying quite a lot of tax into treasuries, which may not spend it well. Indeed, some of it may be stolen. But that is how you build up the success of a government providing services, that they raise their own taxation. I thought also that the Girls' Education Challenge Fund, which said it would educate 1 million girls in the most difficult parts of the world where there wasn't a state system and where it was really challenging, was a very important innovation that we made. In fact, it educated 1.6 million girls. It lasted for 10 years, but it was very expensive by definition because you were doing it in difficult places. So that was really our first floor. And I think also we understood that you had to turn the department from being a bit of a sort of love child of prime ministers, which it was, of Blair and Brown and Cameron. You had to make it stand on its own 2 feet, so you had to make sure that it was seen as a department of state for development in the developing world, and not as a well-upholstered NGO. And I think also with the multilateral aid review and the bilateral aid review, we were working on that basis, that we had to instill a deeper belief. The Poverty Impact Fund, hated by civil servants because it managed small amounts of money, was very, very time intensive, but was essential for winning support amongst members of parliament because they could relate to it and they could influence it. The event every year to show people, we did the vaccinations and the Gavi replenishment, then we did the family planning summit, to show taxpayers why it was good to invest in this. And the stopping of budget support, which the book quite rightly says, is by far the best way of doing development. If you can trust the people to whom you're giving the money to spend it wisely and not to steal it. So if you can do it, it's much the best way of doing development. But we knew and understood that the public wouldn't stand for it. And therefore, we had to row back from budget support. And this was all designed to try and make sure that we built this British policy and we sustained DfID. Now, of course, it was a massive failure overall, because that consensus that carried on has been broken essentially by Johnson, but broken now. And I think that the support for development, which in the austerity years we got up from 46 to 50%, so we did pretty well on that, much more so amongst women and much more so amongst younger people. That was an example of what you can do if you get a Prime Minister and a Development Minister who really care and evangelise about this. And remember that only 5 members of Parliament in the entire House of Commons voted against the 0.7 when it came in as a law. So that was one big failure. And I think the other failure we've had is the SDGs, although the SDGs are very challenged by the way the world has changed. I think having so many, it being a sort of Christmas tree off which everything was hanging, has made it less effective. I think looking back on it, the MDGs were very effective indeed. So I then come to my final of the 3 points I wanted to make, which is this. Once Johnson described DfID as a cash machine in the sky, spewing out money, I mean, I nearly had a fit, because I saw that damaging all the good work that had been done. It would be seized on in the Dog and Duck public house in Sutton Coldfield as an example of the way the money was not being well spent. But the truth is, on the front of this book here, that DfID transformed Britain's position in the world. It really did. Indeed, I think you could argue that since Suez in 1956, it is the best example of genuine British leadership, making an impact around the world, respected around the world, and very effective as a result. And of course, many people have said this, it was the greatest engine of development in any sort of bureaucratic sense in tackling poverty. And the reason why DfID was so effective was not because it was a Department of State in a government in London. It was because of the people who congregated around the flag. And boy, did I see this when I got back into government. And meeting old DfID people in the Foreign Office was like meeting people who had emerged from the rubble of a nuclear explosion. And you saw these various cadres, which are very well set out in the book, had been hollowed out, and the capacity for delivery that Mark referred to had been so very, very badly damaged. And the success was the collection of people who were there and who created this extraordinary machine for the alleviation of poverty. And when I arrived, I used to rather regret it when senior people would come and see me in my ministerial office and say they were going. And I thought, you know, it's not very good that they're going. But I soon learned that actually that was the wrong reaction, because they were going to the development institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, Geneva, New York, Washington, all around the world. And that expertise always, you know, related to DfID when they went there. DfID, never forgotten, was so important. So in the end, you know, through a mixture, I guess, of prejudice and lack of knowledge, Johnson vaporized DfID. When I was back in government, I realized that actually the structures of development were more important than the money. You know, we were spending, when Labour left office, they were spending about 0.52. We were spending on our way up to 0.7, about 0.54. Last year, we spent 0.58, although admittedly, we're having to pay for the first-year asylum seekers. So we invented all these ways of generating more money, guarantees, a whole series of ways of working with the multilateral banks. But I sort of thought that it was the lack of DfID which really made the difference. And I'll just end on this point. Here is the acid test. I give you 2 examples of what the damage that has been done by the vaporization of DfID. The first is Mali, where we supported the French in an operation there. They went there, first of all, they cleared out the terrorists, they drove them all out to the north. And then they didn't do anything. And we helped, we were part of the operation. And what did the poor people in Mali, the women, the people with young children, see of this intervention by France with British support? They saw shiny vehicles with shiny soldiers driving around with shiny weapons. What did it say to a mother who wanted to give birth safely? What did it say to a mother who wanted to educate their children? What did it say to people who wanted to make sure their children lived beyond the age of 4 or 5? Nothing. And at the National Security Council meeting, I am told, I wasn't there was one still voice of DfID, a middle-ranking woman who said, it won't work unless you address the social aspects of this, unless you show the people of Mali that there is a way where this builds their life, and just beating back the terrorists without doing any of that was a big mistake. Now, I don't believe that DfID in its heyday would ever have allowed that mistake to have been made. And the final point is this. Gaza, everyone in this room will have a view about Gaza and what Gaza means. It is a disaster. And what we have had, actually, is humanitarian intervention from Britain, from the EU, from the UN, from some of the regional powers, other European countries. It's been a hodgepodge of intervention. And we ended up in the ludicrous position where, because we couldn't use perfectly good roads to get stuff into Gaza, we were dropping it by air. A disparate group of aircraft would drop it. It killed some people by landing on their heads. And we towed, can you believe it? We towed a pontoon across the Atlantic from Virginia down the Med to the coast because we couldn't use roads to get stuff in, and that didn't work either. Now, I'm certain this is true, and I have tried it out on a couple of other secretaries of state. I'm certain this is true. Had DfID been in its heyday, the Secretary of State would have called together the most senior officials and said, look, we've got a very serious situation here. We have to address the humanitarian disaster that is upon us. We need a plan. And those senior officials who I described would have fanned out across the world, not to put a Union Jack on it, but they'd have gone to the UN, they'd have used their contacts, and a strong plan, which everyone could then buy into, probably fronted by the United Nations, would have been put together. Now, had that happened, I think there is a goodish chance that the Israeli cabinet would have been persuaded to support it, because it would have been heavily supported around the world, it would have been expert, and it would have been effective. And that was not what happened. So I give you those 2 practical examples for why the vaporization of DfID has done such damage to British reputation around the world, but also our ability to champion these aims that are so well set out in the book, and which Mark described so well in his opening remarks.
Thank you, Andrew. Lots to pick up there, and I'm sure Mark will want to come back on some of those as well. But Sarah, yes. To pick up with you as firstly, reactions to the book and comments based on what the others have said, but also as an observer of international development, sort of from very close but slightly outside government. What's your assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of DfID as a standalone department and FCDO as it now is?
So I need to fess up to all of you. I'm not a development expert, and I haven't been a development minister. What my job has been since February 2020 is to scrutinise what these people do. So I don't have all the information, but I do have that sort of broader vision, and I also have that accountability about justifying every pound, every policy, and seeing some ministers wriggle on the hook and others, and you are blessed to have Andrew Mitchell here, who has such passion and drive to get things done. What I would say is, and this is not my fault, almost as soon as I got in post, DfID was blown apart and I mean, it wasn't dismantled because that requires a degree of organisation. It was nuclearised, it was pulverised, and really for no good reason. Read the book. Both be proud of what we had and angry at what we've lost, and grateful for this man at the end for doing everything he possibly could to try and rebuild it. And huge credit to you, Andrew. I mean, you went at it with such passion, and that was what was needed at the time. But I remember a week, 2 weeks after Andrew got appointed, I went and met him, and he was ashen. He was like, Sarah, I can't believe just how bad it is. And it really was bad. About September of 2020, so I think it was June that all the announcements came. So February, the announcement to merge the departments, June, the first big cut of funding. But we're under COVID. So in September, I think it was, I took the committee over to Geneva to meet all of the big international partners, so the World Health Organization, the International Committee for the Red Cross, etc., who we had worked with for decades and decades. And I cannot tell you the hostility and anger that we were faced with because of this act of vandalism that had been carried out. Because I can't underestimate to you what damage it did to our international standing. And it's because we were seen as a country that did the right thing for the right reason. And it wasn't conditional. It didn't have trade deals associated with it. Although, you know, you would want to trade with people that you trusted and respected. That wasn't its objective. There was no conditionality to it. It was also, as both speakers have said, the quality of the experts that we had and the generosity that we would have just to share that for the common goal of trying to basically eradicate poverty and all the consequences of it. And people were so angry with us, and we were the first British politicians that they'd seen. And I remember talking to one woman, and I said to her, oh yes, but you know, you do understand that this was the decision of a few politicians that have sort of bullied their way through. That doesn't represent the British people, and you know, you can't blame us. And she looked at me and she went, well, you all voted for Brexit. You are choosing to leave the world stage. And it very much felt like that. I paraphrase James Cleverly when he was minister, because when he, foreign secretary, well, minister and then foreign secretary, when he came in, he was sort of effectively running his lines. And he said, Sarah, I get it. We have a seat at every table because we put chips down on the table, and the chips were our expertise. And he said, why have we taken that off? And what is that going to do to our international standing, our international reputation? And again, I don't mean to underestimate it or to be too graphic. We hemorrhaged our expertise, because the one thing that I know about development people is they do it not for the job, not for the status, not for the career progression. They do it because they really, really care about it. They're a very specific breed of passionate people, and we lost their faith and we lost their trust, and therefore we lost their skills and the associated benefits of having them on our payroll. And I think it's going to be incredibly hard, if not, I'm sorry to say, impossible, to rebuild that trust, that reputation, and that seat at every table because of what's happened.
Thank you. What do you think the FCDO needs to do now? What's your committee going to recommend?
I think, sorry to fangirl, I think the biggest thing that Andrew Mitchell did was get back a permanent secretary and wrestle the budget away. And Andrew was also a cabinet member, I think, and I think that's a really, really important thing to do. We've still got the permanent secretary. It looks as though the Secretary of State, Annalise Dodds, has got complete control of her budget. Not that she has all of the ODA foreign aid budget anymore. It's been, well, raided by the Home Office. So those two things are important. But I think it's having a very clear outcome-focused vision about what we're trying to achieve, to get the long-term stability back and to get the trust back. And it's not impossible, but the one word of warning to manage expectations is where we left, a lot of other countries rapidly filled that gap. So I'll give an example. The World Service yesterday were talking to parliamentarians, and they were saying that in, I think it was Iran, when they withdrew the service there, they needed to put in like a pop-up emergency service with all the discontent that was going on there to fact check, to put some reality out there. And they discovered that Russia had taken over their frequency. And when they listened in, what Russia was putting out was basically propaganda. So it's not as though the world has paused while we've sort of regathered. Other countries have come into that space, so it's going to be difficult.
Thank you. There's a dangerous display of consensus on the panel. So one of my jobs is going to be to try and disrupt that a little bit, and you can all pelt me with crisps later. But Mark, I was going to come back on anything that you've heard. I was really struck by a phrase you used in the book, which was that you'd potentially, you could say whether you do or not, come to think that the 0.7% was an albatross around DfID's neck. And that also, I mean, it picks up on what Andrew said about structures being more important than money. And I think there's quite a lot in that. We've also had a question online about effectively, where is it? I'll come back to it. Why should the UK have a standalone aid programme if not to garner influence or to make effective reparations for historic transgressions? So there's the kind of realpolitik of the 0.7%, of the link between poverty reduction and national interest, and the sort of unfraying of that seems to be part of the demise of DfID. So, I mean, Mark and then maybe Andrew on the same question.
Well, Andrew yesterday, in a brilliant piece for Conservative Home, which you must all read avidly every day, set out why reducing poverty is in fact in the national interest. So that bifurcation is, it's a misunderstanding of the way the world actually is. If the UK wants to be safe in the wider world, then we need to care about what's going on in very, very poor countries, because they are the places where problems originate and from where they spread. On the 0.7 thing, Ranil and I are, the judgment we came to was having the 0.7 met in 2013, and we explained the debate that went on between Nick Clegg, in fact, and David Cameron at the time, and having the law, and we make the point that Andrew had advised David Cameron, in fact, that putting this 0.7 into legislation may not be the best idea, but in fact all the parties going into the 2010 election said they would, for reasons of not wanting to be outflanked. Those things, I think there's an argument to be made that they ended up being counterproductive, particularly because if you look where the money went in 2013, 2014 onwards, that increment went. It did not come into DfID primarily. The large slug of that additional money was sprayed around government, and when the use of it was reviewed by the brilliant ICAI, one of Andrew's inventions basically, who have proved to be a force for good, including for Sarah's committee, when ICAI looked at the way other government departments were spending that money, they found the impact wasn't very good. And that's not very surprising, because those departments are paid to do different things. So I think what happened was politics got a little bit ahead probably of where the public was on how much willingness there was to have a large aid programme. As Andrew said, there's a lot of public support for saving lives in crises and vaccinating children and sending girls to school. All the polling reveals that's what people are willing to sign up to. But but they want that to be kept within a reasonable balance.
And just on that, Andrew, I'll come to you in a second, but the sort of the media reporting, the media sort of froth, the media critique on individual projects, and clearly politicians have to react to that, need to be cognizant of that, but can sort of overreact. We were talking earlier about the St Helena question, which you do touch on in the book. How does a department like DfID or now the FCDO kind of respond in a way that isn't on the defensive about those stories, but kind of gets over them and into the reality, but also recognising the importance of public consent?
Right. So let me tell you the St Helena story. St Helena, island in the middle of the South Atlantic, inaccessible except by sea for the whole of human history until very recently. Napoleon was sent there after Waterloo as a place he couldn't remotely escape from, and he died there several years later. A debate had been going on for a while, including in the sort of 2005 to 10 period, about whether we should try and build an airport on St Helena. When Andrew came in as the Secretary of State in 2010, he told us we should build an airport on St Helena, and Minouche Shafiq and I commissioned work from the economists in the department to look at the economics of it. And it was marginal, to be honest. The benefits may have exceeded the cost depending on the future level of tourism and the diversification of the economy. But Andrew was entitled to tell us, no, we're going to build the airport. So I then spent the next 6 years fretting away at the remotely, the deeply plausible scenario that we wouldn't be able to build this airport and it would have a massive cost overrun and we'd never do it on time. And I took meetings every 3 months on this for the whole of that 6-year period, and I was flabbergasted when in late 2016 we built the airport on time and to budget. And then what happened?
The company went bust, of course.
Well, that was their problem. That wasn't on the taxpayer. That was not on the taxpayer. That was a well-managed thing by your officials, I'm going to remind you. What then happened was a 737 was flown in as a test drive of the runway, and as it was coming into land, it was bounced all over the place, and the turbulence, it turned out, was too strong to allow a 737 to fly in. So what then happened was a huge hullabaloo. Britain builds White Elephant in the middle of South Atlantic. The hapless permanent secretary, that would be me, was summoned to the Foreign Affairs Committee and the IDC, in Sarah's predecessor, and the Public Accounts Committee, ritually lambasted. Had to be careful what he said. On the our great friend Alex, Jeremy Hayward, observed the front pages of the newspapers on the 30th of December 2016 when my knighthood was announced, and my mum actually was watching on the TV that night, Sky News, and the front pages of the tabloids were Sir Waste-a-Lot. So Jeremy rang me up and said, thank you, comrade, because you got me off the front pages. They're not talking about Sir Cover-Up anymore. And in the meantime, what we were doing was two things. Firstly, we were finding what aircraft would land on this runway. And secondly, we were suing the contractor who told us the 737 would be a good solution. And of course, that was settled out of court. The result was the contractor admitted no responsibility, firstly. And secondly, proof's in the pudding, wrote a cheque for a 7-figure sum to the department. So everybody could see what was happening. Now, to your point of what the public understand, last week on his normally quite good podcast, George Osborne, Andrew's friend, piped up with a canard that among the many failings of public investment was this airport on St Helena. So sometimes when you solve problems, it's hard to get across the solution and the good thing. And that is a challenge. And if you're in a department like DfID, what you have to do is use the fact that you're heavily scrutinised as an incentive to make sure you make as few mistakes as possible. And when something does go wrong, you fix it as quickly as possible.
So we're going to start a beef with the Osborne Balls podcast, and I can assure you that permanent secretaries don't normally call each other comrade. That's not just anyone worried about impartiality. I mean, Andrew, anything that I sort of flagged up the poverty reduction national interest point, and Mark plugged your Conservative Home article that sets out your view on that. I'd be interested in that, and link it, if you can, to the sort of persuading the public of value.
Well, I mean, Mark said it very well. Every penny of the British development budget is spent in the national interest, or should be spent in the national interest, for the reason why Mark set it out. And we should be clear about that. And if you don't think it's being spent in the national interest, then you go to the ICAI. I used to say to the Daily Mail, who'd ring up and say, what is this latest hideous idiocy that you're doing with the development budget? I say, well, go to complain to the ICAI. They're the taxpayer's friend. They're the watchdog. ICAI is very unusual because ministers don't, on the whole, give up power. And we said, you know, ministers can sweep inconvenient truths under the carpet. This body will be independent of ministers and structurally independent of ministers, and it will report to the executive. Its boss is Sarah. It's not the minister, and that's incredibly important. So I do think that one can be pretty clear about that. Can I just say something about the airport? Because, and I just want
it's an event about St Helena.
St Helena. I just want to be quite clear because I've been explaining to all these new Labour ministers who think that the enemy is the Tories sitting opposite to the House of Commons. So the enemy is not the Tories. We are the opposition. The enemy is the Treasury, and they are learning the truth behind this. But on the airport, I had authority, and Mark will correct me, I think, to spend £250 million. This came in under that, but I insisted that the Treasury, through their big projects analysis, analysed it. And Danny Alexander was therefore responsible for validating the decision that we made. The Treasury DNA clearly in this. Let's be clear about that. I don't think the publicity was handled as well as it should have been when the airport opened, because while there was a problem, it wasn't really wind shear. We soon found a new aircraft to go there. Aircraft are going in and out all the time now. It will be cheaper for the taxpayer in the long term because you otherwise have to keep on renewing the boat. But it does require two things. It requires, first of all, that you link up the bits, which weren't always. I always said that there need to be low millions spent on cutting their energy costs, their electricity costs, which are terribly high, on putting in the connectivity, which actually the EU did, and the EU very generously put in the connectivity, and making sure that when they can keep their fish cold by the you know, they're not being priced out of the market by the cost of electricity. Those things, I think, are happening now. They took a long time to get through. And the other thing is this: there is in every single French town a Bonaparte society.
Yeah.
So what you need in the governor is not a middle-ranking Foreign Office official. You need an entrepreneur. Because, you know, at some point, someone's going to get this point, and they're going to set up flights from France.
I'm mildly worried we're going down a St Helena rabbit hole. So I'm going to...
Okay.
Sorry, Andrew, to move you on.
No, I'd finished going down. I'm just saying that, you know, these things are often not quite what
It was my fault. I shouldn't have introduced such a
you
subject.
started
but
it.
I know, yeah. And for Andrew's thoughts on the national interest point, I do commend the Conhome article. Sarah, briefly, and then we'll open it out to questions. Role of scrutiny has come up a few times, and obviously you're the absolute best person to ask. How do you see the role of parliamentary and other scrutiny in improving the decisions that are made, regardless of the institutional arrangements in this particular area?
So I think, I would say this, I think scrutiny is hugely important because it reassures parliamentarians as much as it reassures the public that their money is being well spent. We've seen many occasions where we have challenged and the government ship has just shifted a little bit. We never get credit for it, but you just go, oh, okay, we did that. I think the thing that is important is, from a parliamentarian, you know, I'm a backbench MP. There are debates happening all the time. There are many different government departments. And to know that a group of your peers are scrutinising in depth what a government department is doing and will bring to you anything. So, you know, my committee, we raised that the Home Office was given a blank cheque to the aid money to spend on refugees in this country, when most other countries were using Treasury money to do that. So we were able to go to parliamentarians here. You need to be aware of that. I think that's a really, really important point that we do. But one of the things, and I'm not talking about airports, one of the things that I think we have and the department has been bad at is bragging about itself. Because I think most people, when they think about development, they actually think about humanitarian crises, conflicts, that sort of thing, where we are absolutely fantastic. But that's a small percentage of what the department does. And actually, the bread and butter of giving people a more decent life, opportunity to be safe in their home, I think that that's a really, really important thing. And I would just say that I don't know any faith groups in my constituency or anywhere that aren't raising money for those sorts of projects. We're a diverse country. The number of people that are sending money back is enormous. And I think what we actually need to be doing, and you asked how do we rebuild the department, is we need to be a bit more front-footed about saying this is actually what we're spending the money on, and this is why it's a really, really good investment.
Thank you. Right, I will come to questions now, and we started a couple of minutes late, so we might run just a minute or two over. I'm going to give the first word to Ranil, who's seated at the front. Everyone else is only allowed a question. You're allowed a very short comment as well as a question, which is not something I will ever say on the stage again. But Ranil, your reaction to that and any sort of questions for the panel?
I'll apologise in advance. I don't have a question, and I'm not going to tell any more airport stories.
Oh, please.
I just want to just sort of bring together a few strands of what's already been said very briefly. Since we wrote this book, I've had, I think, 4 chief economists of the World Bank talk to me and tell me some version of the story. It was so important to have DfID in the room because they always made useful challenges. They pushed us to be better, and we learned a lot from the way they did this, that, or the other. And I think it's just basically, DfID was an extremely capable organisation. It was unusually capable as a development organisation, and it was unusually capable as a government department. And I think it basically comes from 4 things: people, institutions, that is structures within the department, and processes, and all of those things being arrayed towards an objective, a clear purpose. And well, I think the public policy challenge for us now as a country going forward is that all 4 of those things have been degraded substantially. This is independent of whether we have our own department, which I think will absolutely help make that better. But even within the current structures, all those things could be much, much better. And I think that's the main point that I want to make, really. It's just that we have the scope, and hopefully through this Shafiq review, we will have good recommendations on it to improve matters, and that's where we should be moving now.
Great, thank you. And I have to say, from reading the book from an IFG perspective, it was great to see and we always bang on about have a clear objective, set a clear objective, but see the example of DfID, whether you agree with it or not, of the objective, to kind of really apply that was good. So, other questions? There's some very keen people at the front. We'll go to Katrina first, and then you, extremely keen, and then I'll come down to the front.
I have to just make one comment on Centralina. As a previous economist working on Centralina, the boat journey was so wonderful and romantic. Bring back the boat, I say. My question, Mark, I want to be a little bit provocative and challenge you a bit on, your argument that there's a set of skills in diplomacy and a set of skills in development. I transferred from DfID quite early days into FCO, and I would disagree with that strongly. I think the heart of development is the political economy, and actually that's one of the strengths that good, strong development people have. So why don't we try and make the current model work and be the best in class internationally of a department that's brought together these skills and deals with policy coherence, which is at the heart of what the development agenda is. Trade policy, investment policy being coherent. There's an opportunity if we tackle it well. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you just say who you are as well?
Gina Lang, FCDO.
And the gentleman at the front there, and we'll come to you.
I'm Billy James. I'm a chartered accountant by background, partly brought up in Zimbabwe, and I have some experience of investigating financial fraud in my investment banking career. I visited Zimbabwe in February, and I visited the sites of 3 major DfID projects. Nothing was visible. So my question to the panel is DfID really taking the problem of corruption in places like Zimbabwe seriously?
Brilliant. Thank you. And the lady at the front here.
Gulai from the Coalition of Global Prosperity. What, if any, have the benefits or successes of the merger been, particularly thinking about bridging the gap between defence, diplomacy and development?
Brilliant. So benefits of the merger there, corruption, and the view that it's a fallacy to separate diplomacy and development in the way you suggested. Mark, do you want to come in on the first and then briefly pick up anything else?
Well, there have been no benefits of the merger to deal with that. In Zimbabwe, the big things that DfID, before it was destroyed, was doing in Zimbabwe were things like immunisation, antiretrovirals, and educating girls, which Andrew was a big champion of. And what it wasn't doing was sticking a flag on a school or sticking a flag on a pack of vaccines. So the whole point was not to be visible in doing those things. Corruption is a massive problem in lots of these countries. Actually, aid budgets generally, because there's so much scrutiny and monitoring and management of them, are much less vulnerable to the corruption problem than countries' own resources. If you read all the analysis and the facts, that's the conclusion you come to. I think the problem, Katrina, is the skill set and the capabilities you need for good diplomacy are completely different to the ones you need for development. So what you need is functions which cooperate with each other, preferably under the framework of a National Security Council, but are each charged with delivering their objectives in an effective way. The only people who've ever run this merger proposition are people who wanted to destroy their aid programs. That's what Stephen Harper did in Canada. That's what the right-of-centre government did in Australia, and that's what Boris Johnson did. We do not argue in our book that Britain should be spending more money on aid now. It's actually about 0.3% that we're spending. It's not 0.58, with great respect to Andrew, because a big chunk of that is being spent on looking after refugees in this country. The difficulty is we do not have a machinery anymore which has the characteristics that Ranil just described, which can spend that money well. And for me, the first thing to sort out is what objectives do we want to achieve in the world with our development budget? And the second thing we need to sort out is how do we build a capability and bring back some expertise and have some systems and processes which give us a decent chance of achieving those objectives. Then, when the government's brilliantly successful in increasing the growth rate and we're all feeling better off, you can make a case for a bit more money.
Sarah.
Thank you. I mean, my committee is a cross-party committee, and we didn't make a ruling if you should or shouldn't have a merger and if we should or shouldn't bring a department back. What we objected to very, very strongly was the way that it was done, because it was brutal, it wasn't efficient, and the stress of it is still running through now. I can see from a country point of view to have one door to go through actually simplifies it for everything, because I know when I went on visits you'd have the embassy, you'd have the trade department, you'd have the development department, you might have a British council if you were lucky, and it all became a bit muddled. So I get the one door thing. Where I think it's incredibly helpful to have, if not a standalone department, then a distinction, is when, one, you're sat round the cabinet, because, as the example that was given, a development perspective is going to be very different from a defence, is going to be very different from a diplomatic one. And I also think it preserves the purity of the message that's going forward. If your ambassador is able to be doing one negotiating and your development person is being able to do a different and is seen to be objective and doing it for the right reasons, I think that strengthens our hand. Whereas at the moment, you've got a situation where the ambassador in country is the person that, well, for the last few years at least, has been the one making cuts, while at the same time they're trying to do trade deals. And I think we're tripping ourselves up by doing that.
Thank you. Andrew, any very quick responses to those? Sorry? Any quick responses to those, I said, yeah.
So the benefits of the merger. I mean, the best will in the world, it's very hard to think of any benefits. One of the things I've learnt during my long years in the House of Commons is that big departments don't work. You know, various times both the parties have tried to make super ministries, and actually what you want, and there's those knocking around now who think the Foreign Office should also take over trade, international trade and so forth, but actually what you want are departments which are specialist, dedicated and really effective. So, and the way you join them together is through the National Security Council. The National Security Council, invented by David Cameron, was a brilliant thing to do. You have round the table all the different departments, you talk about what's the national interest and national policy, and then you go away and deliver them. So expertise, that's what's wrong with the merger. You put them all together. And also, I learned as a young banker in the city, there is no such thing as a merger. One side wins and the other side loses. And this was triumphalist Foreign Office. The people in the Foreign Office for years have been trying to take over DfID because they thought they'd get the money. What they didn't realise is the money is programme money.
Yeah.
It's not administrative money. So, the poor DfID people had to implement, this is the thing that was really awful, 3 lots of cuts, which I think caused deep mental anguish. We have to go back and break contracts which you've made because of the sweep of a pen by Boris Johnson. I mean, there are those who would say, with some justice, that at some points in its life, DfID had its own foreign policy. And there were some people in DfID who, I think at certain points, before our time, for my time anyway. But I think we dealt with that quite well because we said the ambassador or the High Commissioner is the head of the platform, and they are the leader in a country of the UK interest and the UK work. But that's the way to deal with it. So I can't, I'm afraid, think of very many things that were a good idea about the merger. In terms of corruption, I mean, the first thing that ICAI looked at was corruption. And they found, that DfID was pretty good at spotting it, and then immediately, zero tolerance of corruption. But this is a subtle thing. I remember going down to Nairobi to say to Uhuru Kenyatta, who was then the finance minister, several £1 million of our money for education has been stolen. You're to give it us back. And he said to me, well, of course we will give it you back, but can I just be clear? You didn't discover this. We discovered it, and we told you about it. So, it has to be, it's a quite complicated thing. But what the taxpayer needs to know is that there is zero tolerance for corruption. And just one other thing as well. On the point 7, I completely agree, by the way, on Zimbabwe, where we were trying, when we were in government, to mend a relationship which for too many years had been people behind their own walls and generalizations. And actually, I hope very much the new government will continue to do that. Zimbabwe should come back into the Commonwealth now, and I very much hope it will. But on the point 7, I was, as Mark said, against introducing a law. Because I just don't think declaratory legislation is terribly good for the House of Commons. And if you give your word you're going to do something, you should do it. And after all, I think Tony Blair introduced a declaratory legislation to end child poverty or diminish it, and it promptly went up. So I just don't like declaratory legislation very much. And I think that the merit of the point 7 was it was a very long-standing policy. And you've got to have a budget, and the beauty of the point 7 is it goes up and down with the national economy's performance, which seems to me to be a sensible thing. So I think that I wasn't against point 7. I was just against putting it into law.
Thank you, Andrew. I feel I've been terribly mean with the questions, so apologies for that. But we've had a fantastic discussion. I'm going to wrap up here and do continue it over drinks and nibbles outside. Before I do my closing spiel, a reminder about books. There are books here. If anybody is desperate to get a hold of a book and we run out, Mark and we can arrange to get one to you. So let us know. Just find an IFG person. The event live stream will be available to watch on our website and YouTube, so you can relive the whole experience. And you should check out our website for other excellent events and reports. In a couple of weeks, we've got Chris Whitty, whoever he is, talking about prevention and public service productivity, and there will be lots of reaction to the budget, the US election, and maybe even the Conservative leadership result. So a massive thanks to the panel, to Mark and Ranil for writing the book, and to everybody here, and for those on the live stream. Thank you.